Guys, I just got out of the Odyssey, and you know what? I had a great time. There has been so much Sturm und Drang about this film, and I'm actually percolating a bit of a rant. It might be a full rant share situation. A full rant about why I think this movie and this moment is sparking the discourse that it is. I have a theory. I need to tweak it a bit more in my mind before I dump it on you, but keep an eye out for that. But let's talk about the film, man. If you haven't seen it yet, please don't watch this. Go see it. Come back, because I am going to be talking about specific choices made in the film, possibly some plot points or key decisions. I'm going to try and keep it somewhat non-spoilery, but there's really no way to discuss the things that I liked about this film without, going into some detail. It's also not possible to give you my criticisms of the film without possibly revealing a few things. So if that's not your speed, no harm, no foul. Come back later, we'll chat then. For all of the months of Sturm and Drang about what this movie would be, it was a Nolan movie, which is to say, it was full of things that I really, really liked. It was full of choices that I thought were narratively brilliant, and a few that I thought were just weird and didn't really work. It had some incredible set pieces that genuinely left me in awe. And it had some set pieces that I'm like, I think you just left that in because you really liked it and you didn't want to cut it, but it didn't actually need to stay in the movie. It had some really, really big ideas, some of which were executed extremely well, and some of which I think were fell a little bit flat in the delivery. In the ones that were executed well, I thought were really interesting and thoughtfully done, and the ones that fell flat, I'm like, oh, I see what you were trying to do, but you didn't stick the landing, my dude. Some things were brilliant, some things were weird, some things were mid, some things were, I think, genuinely groundbreaking. In no particular order whatsoever, here are some things that I really, really like about this film in particular. First of all, the sound design. I love Nolan's sound design. He makes interesting, big choices that turn a movie viewing experience into a full body one. I think he did this most successfully in Oppenheimer, which, again, if you've seen it, if you saw it in the theater, you know that there are big, big moments in that film where the sound literally encompasses you as an audience member. Your experience of the sound is intrinsic to your experience of the movie. And he did it again here in the Odyssey in ways that I really, really liked. There were, I think the composer is probably on the short list for an Oscar nomination for his work on it, because he made choices about the instruments that he used and the kind of quite literally ancient sounds that he was trying to incorporate into the composition and the design of the film. I think this really, really succeeds in some cool ways. But again, there are experiential aspects that are really, really cool. My best example of this is the scene with the sirens, which, if you know, you know. Again, if you don't want spoilers, please, please, please don't watch. But Nolan makes such an interesting choice in that we, the audience, never hear the sound of the sirens because, narratively, mythologically speaking, everyone who ever heard their song died. So how could we, the audience, experience something and still be living, right? But there's a plot point in the Odyssey where Odysseus wants to hear the song himself, so he is strapped to his mast while he orders his men to stop up their ears with wax. And there's a cool moment where you see one of the characters put wax in one ear and the other, and the sound design of the theater muffles the sound in stereo, so you, the audience, experience that change as that character does. It's so cool. And then you're witnessing Odysseus hear the song of the siren and the journey it takes him on for good and for ill, but you yourself never experience it. I loved that. I thought it was clever. I thought it was interesting. It was classic Nolan sound design for me. There's also another cue that, again, for me, just mwah. They add this element to Odysseus and his use of his famous bow, where he always plucks the string to kind of signal to his hunting prey that he's about to strike. And I don't know if this is intentional, but to me, it sounded quite literally like a lyre being plucked, which, if you know how ancient poetry was portrayed and performed, you know, there would always be like a strum, a pluck of the lyre, and then you would, you know, hail Muse. There was just something about that sound to me. Again, I need to research this more, but the first time I heard that pluck of the bowstring, to me, I just went, hail Muse, sing to me Muse, like, of the man. Like, oh God, it was so good. I loved it so much. It was such a cool, mythological, ancient sounding sound choice for a modern take. There has been so much discourse about the costuming, and I gotta be honest, I have mixed views of the costuming. Some of the costuming choices I really liked. I thought they were narratively, visually, conceptually consistent, and then every once in a while there was a costume that just felt out of place. It felt like it was in a different kind of film. I think the film for me was at its strongest when, you know, we saw like rough woven linen textures, things that looked like they would have been handcrafted, the kind of material we see Penelope herself weaving on her loom. The use of leather, the use of fur, the use of what appears to be hand-hammered metals, all felt very cool and interesting. But every once in a while, there was a particular costume choice or design that felt discordant to me. It felt more like, you know, the 1960s versions of sword and sandals films, which were done in a totally different aesthetic style to referencing ancient Greece. Like, to me, this really came across in some of Telemachus's costuming choices. Even when you see the Trojans, the everyday people looked like they were all in the same film to me, while some of the guardsmen in their what are meant to be uniforms felt a little bit more fantastical or sci-fi to me. So my issue there is not that the choices were fantastical, it's that I found certain elements to be discordant one with another, if that makes any sense. I thought the costuming worked best when it was more consistent, when it all looked like it came from the same world, which combined historical and fantastical elements, but in a way that made the pieces feel lived in. There was a grittiness to them. There was a homespun quality to them. There was a banged up and beaten quality, particularly to Odysseus's crew's costumes, most of them that I thought really worked. The one exception to this, hilariously, I'm gonna say, is Agamemnon's costume. Now, the internet lost its ever-loving mind when we got the first stills of Agamemnon's costume, because, lest we forget, a bunch of dude bros immediately started freaking out about how ahistoric it looked. They also felt the same way about the giant sequence, which I'll come back to that, so put a pin in that. But a lot of people looked at Agamemnon's armor and went, oh my God, you know, that's not historic. And they're right, it's not. And that it's not supposed to be. It's mythology, it's fantasy, calm down. I did a whole separate video about this. I'll link this elsewhere, but like, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine for mythological figures to look a little fantastical. I thought Agamemnon's costume looked a little bit wacky. It looked a little bit extreme, but in the context of the movie now, I think it worked for a bizarre reason. Hear me out. There is a pristineness to Agamemnon's costuming. To me, he looked like he was wearing a costume, as opposed to the rest of his army, which actually looked, you know, battle beaten and battle weary at different points. He looks like a man who never lifted a sword a day in his life, which is genuinely fascinating in the context of this story, where Agamemnon is using the excuse of the Trojan War to expand his own power, something that is alluded to in the text of the film. So for Agamemnon to kind of have this over-the-top costume instead of actual functional lived-in armor actually kind of worked in the narrative for me in a way that I was not expecting when I first saw the costume. I foresee that a lot of people will be cosplaying as Agamemnon in the future. I have seen, originally people were mad about how ahistoric it was. Now a lot of people think that this man is like the finest thing since sliced bread because he has such aura and presence in this, makeup and costume that he's in. And pick a struggle, pick a lane. You either want historic authenticity or you want aura. He gave you aura, and I stand by my take. Clytemnestra did nothing wrong. The man deserves everything he got. Overall, not just in the costuming, but a lot of the set pieces, there was a reality to them. And I don't just mean that there were actually physical sets as opposed to CGI. I mean that when you look at the archaeological sites we have of the ancient world and recreations of them, you get the texture of them. You get the stone, you get the wattle and daub, you get the woven wood pieces, you get the physicality of that world, I think, in interesting ways. And by creating physical sets, Nolan really leaned into that, I feel. But also, I really felt like I was looking at a modern interpretation of an authentic ancient world. I liked the sense of the stone dust on the stone. I liked the sense of the texture of the walls of Troy. It felt like a real place to me. I've traveled in Turkey, I've traveled in Greece. I think they really nailed the terrain of that area in a way that you don't always see in a lot of swords and sandals. Sometimes they get more of a fantasy realm, a lusher kind of environment. But, we see the olive trees, we see the rockiness, we see the desert, we see the kind of scrub forest as opposed to sweeping trees. It felt very, very Greek islands to me, or the shore of Turkey to me. The sand got everywhere because we were dealing with beaches and we're dealing with the seas. I don't know, there was a tactile quality to the set design, to aspects of the costuming, to the design choices that were clearly made throughout the production that I thought worked really, really well and lent an overall quality of realism, even though aesthetically it's obviously a modern production with modern sensibilities and things like armor. Something else I really, really liked was how this production approached the mythological and the magical. It was weird in the Old English sense. It was at the same time uncomfortable and foreign, and yet still very present and real. For example, Circe's island, when they get there and they get to her residence, she looks like a normal person. She looks like a real person. She looks like a house and cooking pots with dust on the floor. And also, she gives a fantastic performance of quiet menace and rage that I'll come back to this. This was probably the wrong example to choose, but when they just made the magical qualities feel both profound and mundane at the same time. In a way, I imagine that someone in the ancient world would experience when the other world and the real world probably lived side by side in ways that we in the modern world just don't. I like how Odysseus experiences the character of Athena in a way that not everyone can. I liked how the other world was our world, but different from what he would have known. Like, I think they must have filmed in Iceland or something like that, because when Odysseus is badly off course, I thought it was really, really smart to make the set design and the set pieces so unlike the Mediterranean and so unlike Greece, to just visually signal that these men are off course. They are not where they are supposed to be, and nothing is familiar. The actual scene at Acheron and Hades was fantastically creepy. The way that the shades appear to Odysseus and his crew, a combination of through the ground and through the fog. To me, there were shades of the classic adventure, Jason and the Argonauts, which is a core text to me and my family, but also the black and white version of Macbeth with oh golly, Denzel Washington, and that kind of eerie, otherworldly quality that production and that film brought to that portrayal. The way these helmeted dead men appeared on this beach, draped in fabric clearly to evoke burial shrouds, the way that the character of Tiresias appears and engages with the world. Again, there was like this grittiness and dirtiness and creepiness to it that I think seems intrinsic with an authentically magical worldview. Again, not in a pop culture sense, but in a lived reality sense. The way that it went from, again, the old English sense of the weird and the fantastical to the mundane and everyday seemed consistent to me. The supporting performances in this film are fantastic. They are so good, specifically John Leguizamo and Samantha Morton. Oh my goodness, I feel as though a lot of the supporting roles probably I was more impressed by than the main character in some ways, which even that's not quite fair, but I think, again, the standout roles to me were Samantha Morton and John Leguizamo. They brought, again, a viscerality and realness to their roles, one as Odysseus's faithful servant and the other as a witch, a descendant of the sun god Helios, an aunt, I believe, of Medea, the most interesting to me and powerful witch in Greek mythology, herself a figure of magic and menace. Her performance, the scene, the set piece of Samantha Morton as Circe turning Odysseus's men into pigs, is probably one of the most interesting portrayals of witchcraft I've ever seen on film. I literally don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen it yet, but that is the scene that I keep thinking about because the combination of the filming and editorial and special effects choices, it was so good. I loved it so much. It's not just them though. I think Robert Pattinson gives a very nuanced performance as Antinous, this man who's crafty and cowardly and manipulative and all things deliciously evil. He gives a really good performance in that role. Like, he's at times compelling and interesting and almost like has these brief flirtations with being sympathetic while being like deeply repugnant at the same time. Like, he did a good job. Good job, baby. I'm genuinely in awe of the commitment to physical sets and physical special effects. Like, apparently the character of Polyphemus, the Cyclops, is partially puppetry, which I find very cool. You can tell that there were physical set pieces in the Sack of Troy, which I think make for a more impactful film sequence. They clearly filmed on a boat at different places, which, feels different than filming in front of a green screen all the time. It worked, and it adds some realism to the film. There are a few specific narrative choices that, from a visual storytelling medium, hit exactly how they were supposed to. Again, I'm not going to go into detail, but the character of Athena and the arc of the portrayal of that character was fascinating. I loved it. I thought it was clever and interesting and beautiful. The way that Odysseus experiences the character of Athena alone, he's the only one who sees her, and we get why he experiences her the way that he does. Towards the end of the film, I thought hit very powerfully exactly as intended. That is an example of a really, really, really good Nolan choice, in my opinion. There's wider, nerdier things that I really, really enjoyed. I liked the kind of allusion to the fact of the Bronze Age collapse. You know, if you know about ancient history, you know that there was a period where civilization as it was then kind of fell into disrepair for a little while before it built itself back up again. And the idea of cyclical ages of man is very much built into Greek mythology, but also into human history in the Mediterranean world. And Nolan references that explicitly in the text, which is interesting. I will get back to my complaints about this, but just as a narrative nerd concept, I like seeing the Bronze Age collapse referenced in film. We don't get that very often. I also really, really liked how we could tell how these interrelationships of the ancient world worked. We don't need to, it's not spelled out explicitly, but we get all of the visual language to show how the client-kingship relationships work. We see that Ithaca is a smaller, humbler island kingdom compared to Sparta. When Telemachus goes to Menelaus and Helen in Sparta, we see a much more lavish court than the one that Telemachus is left in Ithaca. And when we get glimpses of Agamemnon, the high king and the high commander of the Greek forces, we see that why he is the high king, the vastness of the city-state he commands. So we get a sense of the interpersonal relationships of the ancient world and how you can be a king and still be subject to other rulers. And, you know, there's implications of politics in that don't have to be explicitly spelled out, but you get anyway as a viewer, that I really like and I enjoy. And just as a student of history, I like seeing portrayed. Something else I really enjoyed that should be self-evident but isn't always is the fact that we see that Odysseus and his crew are middle-aged, because once again, the point is he's been away for 10 years fighting the Trojan War, and then it's taken him another 10 years to get home. So he's not a young man. In fact, all of Penelope's suitors, or the vast majority of them at least, are younger than she is, and certainly younger than Odysseus for logical reasons, which again is made text in the film in ways that I really like. But Odysseus is himself a middle-aged man. His crew are middle-aged men. I like seeing that portrayed. Quite often when we get sword and sandals films, or TV shows, we lean into the beefcake of it all, which, don't get me wrong, I can appreciate that as much as the next girl. But a lot of the bad faith discourse about this movie has been that, oh, Matt Damon is not Brad Pitt in Troy, which is hilarious because I remember when that film came out, and I remember that we all collectively kind of agreed that it was pretty mid. So to see the retcon in the discourse of a certain kind of online bro pining for the days of hunky Brad Pitt being bare-assed in the movie Troy, or, you know, the very normal and historically correct versions of 300, Frank Miller's comic adaptation, are deeply funny to me. It's not inappropriate. Homoeroticism, ancient Greece, they go together. But I like that the film shows the difference in the kinds of ages of the different characters, specifically Odysseus and his crew. Something I really enjoyed, again purely on a nerd factor, is the fact that they made reference to the fact that the Odyssey is not the end of this myth cycle. Like, the ancient Greece myth cycle literally starts with creation and went all the way into the then present day. There was the golden age of, you know, the Titans. There was the silver age of the gods. There was the bronze age of man. You know, the idea was that things got weirder and more complicated almost every age that went by, right? And lest we forget, the ancient world that the Homeric poems portray was ancient to the ancients. Like, I'm saying this really badly, but like, one of my favorite random facts about ancient Mediterranean history is that in the time that we consider ancient Egypt, there were scholars in that time frame studying even ancienter Egypt. Like, ancient Egypt had a department of ancient Egypt studies, right? Ancient Greece to us was also looking back on a more distant and mythical age for which they didn't always have written records compared to oral ones. We are getting a circa 5th century written retelling of an oral tradition that probably goes back centuries and centuries, if not thousands of years in the past. One of my favorite random facts about history is that there's a really, really compelling theory that the myths of Hercules, for instance, probably date to the Mesolithic period, if not the Stone Age, and are telling, composite stories of a much, much older kind of Indo-European generic sort of hero. Like, these myths were old when they were written down 500 years BC. They were referring to ages of heroes, and the age of heroes that they were talking about wasn't done. We don't have as complete poems of the Iliad and the Odyssey as some of the others, but the story of Odysseus continues on past the narrative of the Odyssey. In fact, Odysseus hears the call of the sea, and in some of the scraps of the various other epics and pieces of poetry and mythology that we have, we know that he takes to the sea again. Like, this is a man, a mythological character, somewhat doomed to wander in a very, very archetypal kind of way. After he gets back home to Ithaca, we know that the character of Odysseus sets off on another journey again. We don't know what that journey is so much. We only have fragments of it, as I said, but I like that this film pays tribute to that, again, in ways that I don't want to spoil, but the idea that the narrative of Odysseus isn't done is actually very true to the historic text that we have. I think that's neat. But just as I joked at the start that this is a Nolan film, which means that not all of it is good, not all of it was good. Nolan at his best plays with really, really big ideas and sticks the landing. Nolan at his worst has a big idea that doesn't get as narratively well executed as he would wish and kind of has to get forced in at the end. The Odyssey kind of suffers from that. There are some narrative themes, some arcs that he wants to tell and land, but I don't quite think he manages it because most of the points he tries to make have to be made explicit in the end of the 3rd act of the film, as opposed to being better planted and paid off, I think, in the narrative pacing. So I mentioned this in relation to the Bronze Age collapse. Nolan is trying to indicate that a certain age is coming to an end, that the choices that all of these main movers in the mythology cycle of the Trojan War have brought about something of a collapse, indicated to be the Bronze Age collapse, that the ripple effects of this violent conflict are spreading across the Mediterranean, whether it's pirates or refugees or just instability into the trade networks. Whatever happened in Troy is spreading and negatively affecting the rest of the Mediterranean, which historically accurate. But again, has to be explicitly stated and pointed out and contextualized in the 3rd act in a way that I think takes away from the message. I'm not sure how I would have done it differently. I think that there could have been more of maybe an Inception-like reveal that Odysseus and co, or the homecomers of the Trojan War, are themselves kind of the notorious sea peoples who are wreaking havoc on the Mediterranean through their various antics and exploits and returning home. But there isn't a kind of reveal of that. There isn't a moment where Odysseus or other people come to that realization. He just kind of has to say it at some point. I don't know. It takes away from the point Nolan is trying to make. The bigger point, that history happens in cycles, that cycles of vengeance and justice and cosmic turnings of the wheel, if you believe in the gods and mythology, come back. That the consequences of your actions come home to roost, doesn't quite land in the way that I think Nolan wanted it to. Similar to this, I think Nolan is trying to convey a sense, again, of consequence and trauma and grief. Odysseus is contending with the consequences of his actions, right? Being the man who came up with the idea of the Trojan horse and, watched the sack of the city. But again, this is all really, really pounded home in the text of the dialogue to the audience in the 3rd act in a way that I found clunky. The narrative device of the film is that Odysseus is remembering his own story on the island of Calypso because he's, for a variety of plot reasons and narrative devices that pull from the ancient text but reinterpret them, he doesn't remember, and he has to remember his own story, and he's telling it to Calypso to orient himself again. And it's stated he doesn't really want to remember. He's kind of running from the consequences of the destruction he has helped to wrought on Troy and the world. But this is kind of clunky to me, because again, that all just lands in the third act, whereas I think there would have been ways to build that more explicitly into the visual language of the film in a way that would have made that point self-evident instead of something that had to be stated so explicitly. And also, it just doesn't really land for me because it is so truncated into the third act. Odysseus just kind of declaring that feels bad about what's happened. Whereas, drawing from the actual text of the mythology itself and just wider context clues, I think you could have done something more interesting, because as I've ranted before, the Trojan War is technically Odysseus's fault. He is the one who came up with the mutually assured destruction pact, that whoever got to marry Helen would have the support of the other kings who didn't win her hand if ever his rights to her were challenged. Like, that was Odysseus's idea. So when Helen ran off with / was kidnapped, side note, I love that the film leaves it ambiguous because the ancient texts themselves are self-conflicting on this point, and I thought that was a cool, interesting, smart narrative choice for Nolan to have done. And sidebar, if you want to make Odysseus deal with the consequences of his actions, I think it would have been more interesting to make it clear that the Trojan War was his fault. It would have made the guilt he was feeling more impactful, because otherwise he's a man who went from fighting on a beach one day to invading the city the next and feeling bad about it. Which, no, I don't know. Like I said, it was so truncated into the third act that I see the point that I think Nolan was trying to make, and it would have been powerful, but I don't think it was as well executed as it could have been. Finally, as is often the case with Nolan, there were some set pieces that in isolation were visually very, very cool, but made the film long, and I don't know that they actually contributed to the narrative arc. There's one in particular. There is a scene of the sailors in Odysseus's crew coming into a forest and confronting giants. This was a point of contention because their armor seems medieval, fantastical European in design, which I kind of agree with. This is one of the things that could have felt discordant to me, but also worked in the sense that it felt foreign. It felt odd to Odysseus and his crew. They were clearly in a mystical, magical place. So pointy, elvish armor doesn't really make me mad. It's just, I felt like this whole set piece didn't really exist except to kill more men. And there were plenty of things that were killing off Odysseus's crew. That being said, it was cool in isolation. There was, again, this kind of mystical, weird element where the forest is literally moving around and caging in and hurting Odysseus and his crew in a really sinister way that I thought was really, really cool. But again, in isolation, very cool, but it could have been left out of the film and it wouldn't have changed the narrative arc of the film at all. I suspect they left it in because they thought it looked really cool, which it does, but it is an example of Nolan's worst tendencies, where he has a big, cool idea for a set piece that he insists on leaving in, even if it doesn't actually contribute something new or vital to the direction of the story. People are definitely going to quibble with the narrative framing device of Odysseus kind of self-medicating in some ways to avoid remembering his own history in his relationship with Calypso. I think it works as a film choice and again as a narrative device for cinema. So even though it's a change, again, it's one that I get, even if I can see why it might not be popular. But very much speaks to Nolan's style and interest as an art director. Nolan is interested in the idea of how narratives are constructed, how we ourselves construct them and layer them. Most famously, his film Inception obviously deals with this. But that's how Nolan works. He loves a narrative within a narrative. So to me, again, classic Nolan. So by and large, I really enjoyed this film. I thought it was fun. I thought it was a very Christopher Nolan, very 2026 take on an ancient epic text, which has been told and retold and recreated so many times throughout the centuries. Again, I'm working on a totally different video about the discourse around this film and specific artistic choices, because it's going to be a bookend to the one I did before, because I really do think that this film signals something in the wider zeitgeist. The way people were pre-engaging with it, and hopefully that the way that they're engaging with it now, I think is important. And I'm not quite done talking about it, but I do promise I will move on from it shortly. All in all, this was a feast for the eyes, absolutely a feast for the ears. I want more takes on mythology. I want more interesting ones. I want auteurs to bring their own aesthetics and their own ideas and their own, narrative interests to text like this. It's not a perfect movie. I definitely have my quibbles with it. Jeff and I are debating where we rank these in our top Nolan films. I'm not sure yet. Maybe I'll add a comment if I can figure that out. For me, Inception and Interstellar, I think, are still my top Nolan films. I really enjoy those for very different reasons. And I think that there are different kinds of film with different strengths and different weaknesses. This one has a lot of Nolan's strengths. It also has a lot of his weaknesses, but I think it was really cool for him to take on an ancient text in this way. The best things about it are absolutely the supporting choices, the supporting performance choices that were made. I think there are going to be people on the awards shortlist for that, and they deserve to be. I think that the commitment to the physicality of certain aspects of filmmaking and special effects, particularly in the age of AI, I think is important. And if nothing else, I really hope that all of the Sturm and Drang and discourse about this has encouraged people to pick up a translation of a book that they might not have read since high school, if even then. And if nothing else you take away from my rants about this is that mythology is neat and you should read more of it, I'm delighted. Tell me what you thought. Tell me what you thought of those specific choices. Was there a particular take or a particular interpretation or a choice that you really, really liked, or one that you absolutely hated? I am going to be thinking about the choices around Athena's character and Samantha Morton's performance and that whole piece with her as Circe, because, oh God, it was so cool. It was so cool. And John Leguizamo, that man might need the supporting actor award. Just saying. Anyway, that is my immediate knee-jerk reaction to a film I have been talking about for months now. Let's check back in quickly in a bit to talk some more about the discourse, and then I promise, kittens, to move on to other things. I am still editing my book Q2 book report. I promise I haven't forgotten it, and I am still putting together some finishing thoughts on the World Cup discourse, because things keep happening, so I keep having to update my own ideas about this, but stay tuned. Those will be coming soon. Please talk to me about this movie, or talk to me about your other favorite classical takes on mythology. We've had some really cool versions of this. There's Netflix's Chaos, starring Jeff Goldblum, which was a rip-roaring good time. One of my favorite novels in recent years, one that I would love to see adapted by someone who loves the text, The Song of Achilles, one of my favorites. And frankly, all of the stop motion classics from the 1960s that live in my heart, specifically Jason and the Argonauts. I love that film. I love it. I will defend the screaming skeletons to the day I die. Tell me what you love about the current moment or past moments of mythology and pop culture, and we will chat soon, kittens. Thanks for indulging me.